It was 2:47 on a mellow Tuesday afternoon in April of 1993 when the telephone broke the silence in Ruby Marina's living room in Butler, Alabama. The ringing startled her. She quaked as she grasped the receiver, just as she always did when the phone rang out of the blue. 21 long years of waiting had taught Ruby that hope and fear came with the same face. "Mrs. Marina, this is Detective Sarah Pritchard with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation." She lost her knees. She held on to the kitchen counter with one hand and the phone with the other until her knuckles were white. She'd received calls like this before. Oh, so many times. Calls that had given her hope only to dash it. False leads, incorrect names, dead ends. But something about this woman's voice, it was different. "We found her, Mrs. Marina. We found Loi." The words lingered in the air, heavy and otherworldly. Found her. Ruby knew what that would mean. Not alive. She'd come to terms with that years ago, or at least she'd attempted to. But hearing those words 7,265 days after she'd stopped hearing anything else, it cracked something open within her. For more than 20 years, every June 19th, she'd entered the sheriff's office with the same question. "Have you found my daughter yet?" Now at last there was a solution. 5 months earlier, on a sunny September morning, Detective Sarah Pritchard paced on the wraparound porch of a large white farmhouse just beyond Butler. Her badge rode her belt, and an arrest warrant lay folded in her jacket pocket. Behind her stood two uniformed officers as the sun blistered the red clay driveway. In the distance, a dog barked. When the door opened, Robert Hamilton stood in the doorway. He was dressed exactly like any respectable 73-year-old church deacon. Pressed khaki pants, button-down shirt, hair neatly combed. For an instant, confusion flickered across his face. Then something darker, a flash of recognition perhaps, or fear. "Mr. Hamilton," Detective Pritchard said calmly, "I'm with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. We need you to come with us." It was all around in less than an hour. Rumors circled the town square, overflowing from the diner into the barber shop, the way they always do in small towns. "Robert Hamilton, arrested. First Baptist deacon? No, not possible." Yes, that Robert Hamilton. The man who'd helped lead the search for Loi Marina back in 1972. The man whose family had owned land in Choctaw County for generations. The man folks trusted to lock the church after Sunday service. For 2 decades, the citizens of Butler had puzzled over what became of that lovely 19-year-old woman who just disappeared. Now, finally, they were finding out. But the reality that accompanied it was darker than anyone could have imagined. Before we proceed, don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I enjoy hearing your stories, each and every one. Now let's get back where it all started. Loi Marina wasn't meant to be dead at 19. She was meant to get older, teach school, perhaps have children of her own. Born on March 3, 1953 in Butler, Alabama, she was raised in a setting where everybody knew everybody. Sunday dinner at church was a sure thing, and work was what put food on the plate. Her parents, Ruby and Marcus Marina, raised 3 children in a humble shotgun house on the outskirts of town. The type with a screen door that never closed quite correctly and floorboards that groaned like an old melody. Marcus worked long hours at the Butler Lumber Company, returning home every evening with sawdust in his hair and calluses on his palms. Ruby learned to sew, her singer machine chugging through the evening as she took in hems on dresses and repaired jeans for people across the county. They didn't have much, but they had pride, and their children learned the worth of that. Loi was the youngest of the family. Her older brother Joseph, 7 years older than her, already had a job at the mill when she was still in elementary school. Her sister Margaret, only 4 years older, was her closest pal, guardian, and keeper of secrets. Even as a young girl, Loi possessed a gentleness, a gentle heart that picked up on when someone was suffering. She was the sort of child who couldn't help but stop to assist if she saw a stray dog or an injured bird. The family's garden shed was frequently converted into an impromptu animal hospital, complete with bottle-fed kittens and splinted bird wings. Her third-grade teacher once said to Ruby, "That girl of yours has a gift, Mrs. Marina. She senses when someone's hurting. Not only animals, people too." And she was not wrong. All of Butler knew Loi as the girl who cared too much and loved even more. Loi Marina at Chillicothe County High wasn't the prettiest girl or the girl with a following of friends behind her, but she was the girl people trusted. If you were having a bad day, Loi was the sort of person who'd notice before you even uttered a word. She'd sit with you for lunch, share her sandwich, perhaps tell a quiet joke to make you smile once more. And if you had forgotten your homework, she'd give hers up without making you feel guilty about it. That was just who she was, consistent, kind, and always considering others. Loi had always dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. She aspired to be that kind of teacher who made children feel safe and noticed, just the way her third-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had made her feel all those years before. But dreams cost money, and money was something the Marina family never seemed to have. When Loi graduated in May of 1971, reality set in. College was not a possibility, at least not yet. So like so many young women in rural Alabama, she did what she could. She worked. She was employed that summer as a nanny by the Hamilton family, one of the best-known and wealthiest families in Choctaw County. The Hamiltons owned a sprawling farm just beyond Butler, one that had been in the family for generations. Robert and Diane Hamilton had 4 children who required care, and Loi appeared to be just the right person. She was responsible, a good listener, and great with children. They loved her. The money wasn't much, $45 a week, but it was regular, and Loi had a scheme. Every penny she made found its way into a coffee can hidden under her bed. She was saving for college, come what may. Every morning before the sun had risen, she'd assist her mama with preparing breakfast, then head out on foot to the Hamilton farm, 3 miles over a red clay road that curved through the rolling countryside. She didn't resent the walk. It provided time to think, to plot, to dream. Late at night, she'd tell those dreams to her sister Margaret as they slept side by side in their small shared bed. She spoke of community college, perhaps transferring one day to a 4-year institution. She spoke of the Hamilton children, how amusing they were, how much she enjoyed assisting them with their lessons. But Margaret saw something shift in her sister's voice over time. There was hesitation, an unease which Loi could not quite express. She did not ever say it out loud, but Margaret picked up on it anyway. Something about Robert Hamilton, the father, her boss, did not sit right with her little sister. The way he'd glance at her now and again. The way he always seemed to have an excuse to be alone with her. Loi waved it off, told her she was probably seeing things. After all, this was Robert Hamilton, a good man, a deacon at church. All of Butler trusted him. Surely she was being foolish? She wasn't. June 19th, 1972. It was an ordinary Monday morning in the Marina home. Ruby was awake early, as ever, the aroma of coffee and bacon wafting through the kitchen. Marcus sat at the table in his undershirt, perusing the Sunday paper, his work boots by the door. Margaret was preparing to go to work at the diner, her hair being pinned up in front of the bathroom mirror. At 7:15, Loi came into the kitchen in a yellow sundress and white canvas sneakers. Her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon. She had her small cloth bag, the same one she took to work every day, in her hand with a sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of sweet tea inside. "You eat something before you go," Ruby said, not lifting her head from the frying pan. "I'm not that hungry, Mama." Ruby gave her a look. "I don't care if you're hungry or not. You've got a long walk ahead of you." Loi smiled, sat down, and began to eat the scrambled eggs and toast her mother slid in front of her. The only sounds in the room were the soft crinkle of the newspaper and Margaret humming a tune from the radio. At 7:42, Loi got up, kissed her mama on the cheek, and picked up her bag. "I'll see you tonight," she said. Ruby turned away from the sink, wiping her hands on her apron. "You be safe on that road, you hear? And if Mr. Hamilton asks you to work late, you call me." "I will, Mama. Love you, baby girl." "Love you, too." Those would be the last words Ruby Marina ever said to her daughter. At 7:45 a.m. on the dot, Loi walked out the front door and down the dirt driveway. Margaret watched from the window as her little sister vanished around the bend in the road. The yellow dress glowed like sunshine against the dark red clay and the green kudzu that grew along the path. She waved. Loi waved back. Then she vanished from view, and she was gone. The route Loi took every day was simple, so familiar she could have walked it with her eyes closed. From the Marina house, she turned east on County Road 14, a rough dirt road that twisted between towering pine trees and past a few isolated houses. A mile or so in, she'd come to the Caldwell place, an old white farmhouse where Mrs. Eunice Caldwell could usually be spotted on the porch, shelling peas or snapping beans into a large metal bowl. That Monday morning was just the same. At about 8 a.m., perhaps a few minutes later, Mrs. Caldwell glanced out and spotted Loi passing by, as she had a dozen times before. I waved to her, Eunice explained to the sheriff later. She waved back, smiled real pretty, looked just fine to me. Nothing seemed wrong at all. A quarter-mile beyond the Caldwell house, the road branched off. Loi always cut left, Old Mill Road, the one that straightaway led to the Hamilton place. That part was more quiet, more isolated. The pine woods closed in on both sides, and the air always seemed a shade cooler under cover. Now and again, a lumberyard truck would come by with a rumble, kicking up wisps of reddish dust before vanishing once more. Jimmy Tate, one of the drivers for Butler Lumber, was among those trucks that morning. I saw her immediately, he told investigators afterwards. She was on the shoulder walking, out of the way like she always was. I honked, waved at her. She waved at me. That was it. I just kept driving. That was the last known sighting of Loi Marina alive. The Hamilton farm was still a mile and a half down Old Mill Road. She should have gotten there about 8:30. At the house, kids would be finishing up breakfast, and Diane Hamilton, Robert's wife, would have been clearing off plates. Loi would normally just come right in, keeping the morning routine going smoothly, like always. But that morning, she never appeared. At first, nobody gave much thought to it. Diane assumed Loi could have been late or not feeling well. At 9:30, when there was still no sign of Loi, Diane called the Marina house on the phone. No one answered. Ruby and Marcus were already at work by this time. Diane brushed it off. She took care of the children herself that day. Irritated but not concerned. Young people were sometimes unreliable, she reminded herself. Perhaps Loi had simply had enough. Perhaps she'd walked out without explaining a thing. It did happen, but when 6 arrived and Loi hadn't returned home, Ruby just knew something was amiss. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the clock on the wall over the stove. Marcus had just returned from the mill, and Margaret was putting out plates for supper. She should have been here by now, Ruby said softly, voice strained. Perhaps the Hamiltons required her to work late, Margaret suggested, though her own tone rang empty. She would have called, Ruby said. Marcus went over to the telephone and called the Hamilton residence. It rang 4 times before the phone was answered. Hamilton residence, replied Robert Hamilton's soothing voice. Mr. Hamilton, this is Marcus Marina. I'm calling regarding my daughter Loi. She is still at your place, isn't she? There was a brief hesitation. Loi? No, sir. She never appeared this morning. We thought perhaps she wasn't feeling well or something. Marcus's chest constricted. What do you mean she never arrived? Exactly what I just said. She didn't arrive at the office today. Diane attempted to call your house this morning, and no one picked up. Marcus's hold on the phone grew tighter. She walked out of here at 7:45. She was going to your house. A pause that was longer this time. Well, she never did get here, Mr. Marina. Sorry, but I really don't know what to say to you. Marcus hung up and turned to Ruby. Her face was pale. Call the sheriff, she whispered. By 8 that evening, the Marina family was in full-blown panic. Marcus and their son Joseph hopped into the truck and drove the route Loi always used, headlights cutting through the night. They shouted her name out the window repeatedly, their calls echoing off the trees. At home, Margaret sat near the phone, hoping it would ring, that her sister would phone, claiming to have twisted her ankle or gotten lost or something. Anything but what they were all beginning to suspect. Ruby sat at the kitchen table, holding her rosary, murmuring prayers between tears that refused to cease. Sheriff Wade Thornton reached the Marina house a little past 9:01 p.m. He stood attentively as Ruby and Marcus recounted all of it, what Loi had on, what time she left, where she always went. He nodded solemnly and made notes. He said he'd get deputies out on the roads bright and early in the morning, but for Ruby and Marcus, morning seemed like a lifetime from now. She probably just got turned around, Sheriff Thornton said gently, though even he didn't sound convinced. We'll find her. But they didn't. Not that night. Not the next day. The initial 48 hours melted together in a blur of hope, terror, and fatigue. Marcus and Joseph combed every inch of County Road 14 and Old Mill Road by foot, calling her name until their throats were raw. They scoured the area for anything, a shoe, a ribbon, her purse, anything that would indicate she'd simply wandered off and returned home soon. Neighbors joined in. Folks from church brought flashlights and sandwiches, forming search parties that combed through woods and creeks, abandoned sheds, and overgrown fields. The sheriff's department went door to door, interviewing everyone who lived along Loi's route. Mrs. Caldwell, Jimmy Tate, the Hamiltons. Robert Hamilton repeated the same story, calm and steady. Loi never arrived that morning. He'd been on the opposite side of the property repairing a fence line. Diane had stayed home with the kids. Neither of them had seen her. Neither of them knew what had occurred. He actually seemed concerned, or at least he acted as if he were, volunteered to assist in the searches, even loaned out some of the equipment from the farm. We just want her found, he informed the sheriff. At the end of the second day, the sad reality started creeping in like a dense fog over Butler. Loi Marina was gone. Between her front porch and the Hamiltons' farm, down a back road she'd crossed dozens of times before, she had just vanished. And only one person, the one who abducted her, knew why. Sheriff Wade Thornton had 23 years of law enforcement experience. In his time, he'd had his share of bar brawls, burglaries, and the occasional family squabble. But a missing young woman? In Choctaw County? That was different. Thornton was a good fellow, honest, systematic, and popular in town. But he was also a man of his time. It was 1972. In rural Alabama, missing persons cases didn't receive the resources or priority that would come decades later. No computers, no cell phones, no DNA analysis, just boots, notepads, and lots of gut feel. Nevertheless, Thornton made the most of it, and he wasn't kidding when he said he'd find her. The next morning after Loi disappeared, June 20th, the investigation went into overdrive. Thornton convened all the available deputies he had, 4 of them, and started organizing search operations with volunteers in town. They started where it made the most sense, Loi's route. Deputies walked the entire 3-mile stretch from the Marina home to the Hamilton farm, combing the shoulders, ditches, and tree lines. They looked for signs of a struggle, for discarded belongings, for tire tracks that didn't belong. Nothing. Thornton established a command center in the sheriff's office, a small brick structure on Main Street with peeling paint and a single solitary holding cell. There, he tacked up a big county map. Red pins indicated where Loi was last spotted. Blue pins indicated already canvassed areas. Yellow indicated they still had to be checked. Next were the interviews. Ruby and Marcus were next. Thornton sat among them in their living room, notebook on his lap, his questions low and thoughtful. Questions he already had the answers to. What was Loi wearing? Did she have any enemies? Had she talked about being in fear of anybody? Was there a boyfriend? Perhaps someone angry with her? Ruby replied in tears. No enemies. No boyfriend. Loi had been working hard to save for school. She was a good girl, Ruby said, her voice shaking. A sweet girl. She wouldn't have run away. Then Thornton questioned Margaret. He questioned her alone, trying to catch something, anything out of place. Margaret explained to him the past weeks, how Loi had been quieter than normal, a bit preoccupied. She'd written it off as the tension of work. When the sheriff leaned in a little, did Loi ever mention anything particular about the Hamiltons? Margaret hesitated. She said, Mr. Hamilton gave her the creeps sometimes, she admitted quietly. But she never said he did anything, just the way he used to look at her sometimes. Thornton put it down but didn't dwell on it. Guys like Robert Hamilton didn't make girls vanish. Not in Butler. Not a deacon, a property owner, a family man. Or so he believed. That afternoon, the sheriff visited Mrs. Eunice Caldwell on her porch, the same porch where she'd waved at Loi just 2 mornings earlier. The metal bowl of peas still sat beside her, half filled, untouched, since the day the girl vanished. She seemed absolutely normal, Mrs. Caldwell replied, wringing her hands in her seat on the porch, her gaze far away. Smiling, walking like she always did. If anything was amiss, I sure couldn't tell. Jimmy Tate, who drove a lumber truck, had a similar account. He'd caught up with Loi earlier that day, about 8:10, walking down Old Mill Road toward the Hamilton place. She waved, I waved back, he explained. Didn't act scared or anything. Just another Monday. Did you see any other cars on that road? Sheriff Thornton inquired. Jimmy hesitated, furrowing his brow. Maybe one or two trucks heading to the mill. Can't swear to it. Nothing jumped out. Thornton canvassed the neighborhood, backtracking on every possible route. A couple who retired a quarter-mile beyond the Caldwells hadn't noticed a thing. A young mother with 3 children reported being in the house all morning. No one heard or saw a thing. The sheriff's frustration mounted with every dead end. It was as if Loi had disappeared into thin air. June 22nd, 2 days following the disappearance, Thornton made the drive out to the Hamilton farm in order to make formal interviews. The Hamilton land was the county's largest. 200 acres of pasture and pine, 2-story farmhouse with porch that wrapped around it, large red barn, and tidy white fences that stretched out as far as the eye could see. Robert Hamilton greeted him at the door. He was dressed in work clothes, a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, his handshake firm. His expression was somber. "Terrible business, Sheriff," he said, shaking his head. "We've been praying for that girl and her family." They sat down in the living room. Thornton, Robert, and Diane Hamilton. Their children played in another room, laughter echoing faintly through the hall. "Take me through Monday morning," Thornton requested, notebook open, pen poised. Diane went first. "I awakened the children at 7, fed them breakfast. Loi typically arrives at 8:30, so I assumed she would be here. When she hadn't arrived by 9, I guessed that perhaps she was running behind. I phoned her house at 9:30, but there was no answer." "And you, Mr. Hamilton?" Robert sat back in his chair, unruffled and composed. "I was on the south fence line. There were some posts that needed to be replaced. Out since 7, didn't return until lunch. Never saw Loi. Didn't even realize she hadn't reported until Diane mentioned it to me afterwards." "Was anyone with you when you worked?" "No, sir, alone. Easy work, didn't require assistance." Thornton jotted down notes. "Did Loi ever say there were any issues? Anybody harassing her? Anything out of the ordinary?" The Hamiltons both shook their heads. "She was a sweet girl," Diane spoke softly. "Good with the children. Quiet. I just can't see anybody wanting to hurt her." Robert nodded. "If there's anything we can do, Sheriff, you just let us know. We want her found." Thornton believed him. Why shouldn't he? Robert Hamilton was all a man was supposed to be in Butler County. A pillar of the community, a father, a church deacon. No record of crime, no temper, no motive to hurt a 19-year-old girl. The interview took less than a half hour. Thornton thanked them for their time and drove off, crossing them off his list. It would be the largest blunder of his career. As weeks began to turn into days, the search widened. Volunteers scoured through the heavy woods along Old Mill Road, knocking on doors until their throats were raw. They picked through abandoned houses, barns, storage sheds, anything where a person could be concealed or held. Bloodhounds were imported from Mobile. They caught her scent down Old Mill Road but lost it close to a mile from the Hamilton land, where there was a line of dense woods and matted thickets that let only a sliver of sunlight down to the earth. Searchers hacked at the undergrowth with machetes for days. They discovered no trace except snakes, poison ivy, and swarms of mosquitoes. 2 ponds within a 3-mile circle were searched. Nothing. Each drifter, each stranger who came through Butler that summer was interrogated. One man, a Mississippi transient laborer with a police record, was a suspect for a short while. But his boss vouched for him, and there was no sign connecting him to the case. Hope had started to recede by early July. The town continued to whisper about her. Individuals still prayed. But the reality was taking hold. Whatever the fate of Loi Marina, it had not been an accident. And the guy who'd shaken the sheriff's hand that day knew exactly where she was. Thornton took each option under consideration, examining each one like a rock in his palm, the hope being that something, anything, might yield a clue. Had Loi run away? Maybe. But that theory fell apart fast. She left everything behind, her clothes, her savings, her family. It didn't add up. Was there a secret boyfriend? Someone no one knew about? Margaret swore there wasn't, and all of Loi's friends said the same. Might someone have given her a ride? Someone she knew? That was possible, yes. But Loi was cautious by nature. She would not have simply hopped into a stranger's vehicle on an isolated country road. Each lead fell through. Each hypothesis dried up. By July, however, the hysteria that had earlier held the tiny town of Butler in its thrall started to recede. There were jobs to get back to, children to feed, work that didn't pause for tragedy. The adrenaline that had driven the initial searches dissipated and was replaced with a tense, reluctant acceptance. Perhaps Loi Marina wasn't returning. The local press published some brief articles at first. Local girl missing. Search ongoing for Butler teen. Family makes a plea for information. But by August, even the newspapers were past it. There was no news to be had. Only Ruby Marina would not let the case rest. She phoned the sheriff's office every other day, her voice shaking with hope and fatigue. "Any news, Sheriff? Any new leads?" Sheriff Thornton never failed to take her calls, even when he was busy. He was kind, patient even, but his response was always the same. "We're still searching, Mrs. Marina. We have not forgotten about Loi." But in his heart, he knew otherwise. The case was cold. He'd questioned over 50 individuals, pursued all the leads, and searched hundreds of acres of terrain. And yet, there was nothing. And that was it. A thin file was left in the end. A couple of witness statements, some search maps, and photographs of a smiling young woman whose life had just ceased one June morning. It wasn't closed officially, but neither was it active. It became part of the small, dusty pile of unsolved cases any sheriff's office acquires over the years. The ones that trouble a man's conscience but leave him with nothing to work on. Thornton would think about Loi Marina for the rest of his career. He'd lie awake some nights wondering what he'd missed, what clue had slipped through his fingers. But without a body, without evidence, without witnesses, there was nothing more he could do. And it would stay that way for 21 long years. 21 years is a lifetime when you're waiting for answers. To Ruby Marina, each of those 7,665 days was a reopened wound. She awoke every morning in the same small shotgun house where Loi had been raised. She'd walk by the bedroom Loi had shared with her sister Margaret and could feel the force of her absence bearing down on her chest like a boulder. The first year was the most difficult. Ruby couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't keep anything in her head but the constant questions that cycled round and round in her head. Where was her baby? Was she hurting? Was she somewhere? Alive, reaching for home? Or had the worst already occurred? Marcus endeavored to remain strong for her, yet Ruby saw the cost. He grew older by a decade in the span of months. His straight shoulders lost their shape, his eyes sunken with sorrow. He quit attending church, couldn't handle the sympathetic glances or the whispered prayers from good-hearted people who couldn't grasp. Ruby, however, she persisted. Each Sunday, she sat in the same pew at Shiloh Baptist, hands clasped tight, mouthing the same prayer for a miracle she knew in her heart would never occur. And each June 19th, come hell or high water, she walked into the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office and posed the same question. "Have you found my daughter?" The first couple of years, Sheriff Thornton would sit with her, read through the case file, and tell her they were still working on it. But years passed, like they always do. Thornton retired eventually. The new sheriff, a young man who'd never even met Loi, was friendly but cold. The meetings became shorter, the vows weaker. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Marina," he'd tell her. "If anything comes up, you'll be the first to know." Ruby would nod, but in her heart she knew the truth. The case was buried. Her daughter's name was just another file in a drawer no one opened anymore. Still, she kept coming back every single year, because she knew the moment she stopped asking, the moment she stopped hoping, was the moment Loi would truly be forgotten. And Ruby couldn't let that happen. Marcus never made it to see the 10th anniversary of their daughter's disappearance. He passed away in March of 1981, just 3 months shy of what would have been Loi's 28th birthday. Ruby planted him alongside the vacant lot she'd reserved for their daughter, and for the first time in her life, she uttered a prayer she'd never had the courage to whisper aloud before. Lord, if she's gone, please let him be the first to see her. The physicians filled out death certificate with heart attack, but Ruby Marina was wise to that. Marcus hadn't perished because of blocked arteries or bad fortune. He died of a broken heart. For over 20 years, not knowing had gnawed on him. Every unanswered question emptied him out just a little more, until there was nothing but a quiet, exhausted man holding his breath for peace. Ruby found him in his workshop out back, slumped over his workbench, his hands still dusted with sawdust. In front of him sat a small, half-finished birdhouse, the same kind he'd made every year on Loi's birthday. He always said he was building them for her. The workshop was filled with them now, rows and rows of birdhouses, dozens, perhaps hundreds, each one slightly different, all waiting for the same girl to return home. He'd never sold them, never given them away, never discarded a single one. It was like he held on to hope that someday she'd come walking through that door, and he'd be able to present her with one and say, "Here you go, baby girl." At the funeral, Ruby sat stiff by the casket, Margaret's hand clamped around hers so firmly it was painful. Joseph stood a few feet back, jaw clenched, eyes black with anger that had been building for 21 years. When the casket was being put into the ground, Joseph's voice cut through the silence. "This is what they did to him," he spat. "The son of a bitch who killed Loi. He murdered Daddy too. Took him 21 years to do it." Ruby didn't disagree. She couldn't, for deep inside she believed her son was correct. Margaret bore another sort of pain, one that never went away but got heavier with the years. Guilt. She was the one in the family who had last seen Loi alive. She'd stood at the window that morning, seen her little sister walking along the red dirt road in that sundress of yellow waving goodbye. She could see it still in her mind like a photo that never grew old. She hadn't walked with her, she hadn't demanded to drive her, she hadn't done anything. And the worst of it? She'd known something was amiss. Loi had trusted her, explained how Robert Hamilton would stare at her sometimes, how his presence unsettled her. Margaret had advised her to leave. "Get a different job," she'd said. But Loi required the income, and Margaret hadn't pressed. "I could have made her leave," she cried one evening, her husband's arms holding her close. "I could have told Mom and Daddy. I could have done something." Her husband tightened his hold on her. "You couldn't have known, Margaret." But she didn't think so. She thought over that final morning 1,000 times, asking herself, if only she had walked Loi to work, if only she had lingered with her for a little while. Would her sister be alive today? Would their father be standing here today? The questions never ended, and neither did the guilt. Joseph's sorrow was flame. Where Ruby held on to faith and Margaret was consumed by regret, Joseph seethed with anger. He was furious at the sheriff's department for losing. Furious at the neighbors who'd gone on with their lives as if nothing had occurred. Furious at God for allowing his sister to disappear into thin air. But above all, he was furious at himself. He'd always been the guardian, the big brother who was meant to protect his little sister. But he hadn't, and nothing could ever change that through searching, pleading, or demanding answers. Over the years, Joseph became consumed by the case. He retraced Loi's route again and again, driving those dusty back roads until they felt carved into his bones. He stopped at every house, every business, asking the same questions, hoping someone, anyone, would remember something new. He called the sheriff's office so often they started avoiding his calls. Once he even drove straight to the Hamilton farm and confronted Robert Hamilton himself. He was standing in the man's driveway, his fist clenched, his eyes crazed. "Tell me what you did to her." Hamilton had been standoffish, almost too reserved. "I wish I could assist you, son," he'd murmured, "but I don't know anything. Sorry for your loss." Joseph wished he could knock his block off, shake the truth loose of him one way or another. But he had nothing, no one to tell. Nothing but that deep-down feeling that Robert Hamilton was not what he seemed. As the years went by, Joseph's obsession cost him everything. His marriage fell apart. His wife couldn't handle the anger, the long nights, the way Loi's name hovered like a ghost over every argument. She left, taking their 2 kids with her. Joseph didn't even fight it. What was the point? He'd already lost the person who mattered most. By the early 1980s, the Marina family, formerly close and full of laughter, was broken and scattered. Sorrow had etched deep fissures between them, making them strangers, bound by pain. All that was left of the girl in the yellow dress was the silence she had left behind. Choctaw County, meanwhile, was transformed. Between 1972 and 1993, time remolded the landscape. The sawmill where Marcus had toiled for 30 years closed in 1985, putting half the town out of a job. New stores opened, others went out of business. Young men and women departed for larger towns, seeking work and fresh lives. But for Ruby, Margaret, and Joseph, the world had never progressed. Time may have altered all else, but it had frozen for them on June 19, 1972. By the time the 1990s arrived, Choctaw County was a different world. The town had grown old, the faces etched, the streets desolate, and the legend of the past disintegrating like fading snapshots exposed too long to the sun. The sawmill where Marcus Marina labored for 30 years was an empty shell. Its doors finally closed for business back in '85. That closure had resonated throughout the entire community, compelling families to bundle up and move away in pursuit of a better life for themselves. By 1983, the town was reduced in size. Most of the people who'd known young Loi Marina, her warm smile, her gentle niceness, were dead or well into their sunset years. The children growing up now had never even heard of her. If they did, it was only as a rumor in their parents' whispers, a threat, a bedtime tale with a shiver attached. "Don't go walking by yourself," they'd warn. "Don't forget what happened to that girl." Loi had been a ghost tale, a tragic legend retold to caution people to beware. But some didn't just disappear into memory. The Hamilton family, for example, they prospered. Robert Hamilton was a name to be reckoned with in Choctaw County. He had progressed from mere farmer to pillar of the community over the years. He was a deacon at the First Baptist Church, a man of good standing and faith. He served on the County Planning Commission, coordinated community drives, and distributed donations like clockwork. Folks liked him, believed in him, regarded him as one of the pillars of their small universe. When his wife, Diane, died of cancer in 1987, the town mourned alongside him. They delivered casseroles, hugged him in Sunday service, said he was a good man and a good husband. And Robert played his role to perfection, self-effacing, grief-stricken, the epitome of grace in misery. But a long way from the church gatherings and coy smiles, the Marina family's agony had not disappeared. Margaret was still haunted by the same anguish that assailed her all those years ago that summer morning in 1972. She was the last to see her sister alive. She'd seen Loi head down that gravel road and hadn't followed. She'd sensed something was amiss. She just knew it. Loi had shared her secret with her once, of how uneasy she felt around Robert Hamilton. The way his gaze lingered on her, the way he made her uncomfortable. Margaret had urged her to leave the job, to look for something else. But Loi was hard up for money and Margaret had not pushed as hard as she might. "I should have made her quit," she'd wept years later to her husband. "I should have told Mama and Daddy. I should have done something." Her husband attempted to reassure her, speaking softly. "You couldn't have known." But Margaret didn't think so, not for an instant. This morning had replayed itself in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. If only she'd gone with her sister. If only she'd made her drive her. Maybe all would have been different. Maybe her father would still live. The guilt never dissipated. And then Joseph. His sorrow seared more fiercely than anyone's. While his mother held on to belief and his sister drowned in remorse, Joseph's pain turned to rage. Rage against the sheriff's office for dropping the case. Rage against the town for forgetting. Rage against God for stealing his sister and leaving only silence in her wake. And above all, rage at himself, because he was the one who was supposed to keep her safe. That was his responsibility as the big brother. and he'd failed. He spent years running after specters, traveling the same section of road where Loi had disappeared, knocking on every house, every filling station, every broken-down farmstead, inquiring the same pathetic question. Do you remember anything? Anything at all? The sheriff's office tired of him. His phone calls went ignored. Doors began closing on him, but he couldn't release it. One day he even went to Robert Hamilton's farm and confronted him, glared at him dead in the eye and asked him what had occurred that day. Hamilton remained calm, unnaturally calm, and whispered, I wish I could help you, son. I don't know anything. I'm sorry for your loss. Joseph's fists folded. He ached to grab the man by the collar, shake the truth out of him. But he had nothing. No proof, no witnesses, only a gut-deep conviction that Robert Hamilton was lying. That fixation was expensive. Joseph's marriage disintegrated. His wife could not handle the perpetual rage, the ceaseless searching, the sleepless nights. She and their 2 children left. Joseph did not attempt to stop her, did not even try. In his head, he'd already lost everything that counted the day his sister vanished. The Marina family, once loving, tight, and filled with laughter, had been torn apart by sorrow. What was once love had been transformed into coldness and distance. They were strangers who were joined together only by a single common wound, the girl who never returned home. And as Chalco County moved forward into the 20th century, the world around them altered, but that old wound never closed. The town forgot. The newspapers quit printing her name. But for the Marinas, the summer of 1972 was never really over. To most people in Chalco County by then, the name Loi Marina was nothing more than a mere rumor from the past. A caution their parents had spoken about once or twice. Something whispered, supposed to frighten young women into staying in groups or not trusting foreigners. She wasn't human anymore. She was a warning, a specter hovering at the fringes of recollection. But where the Marina family dissipated into sorrow and obscurity, the Hamiltons were getting along just great. As a matter of fact, they were thriving. Robert Hamilton's reputation never faltered with the passing years. He was ordained as a deacon at First Baptist Church, a respected, even venerated member of society. He was a member of the County Planning Commission, organized the Fall Festival, made donations to charities. People talked about him with respect. Good man, that Robert Hamilton, they'd say. Salt of the earth. His kids were grown, successful, living beyond their own lives. His wife Diane died in 1987 after a long illness with cancer, and the entire town came out to grieve her. People brought casseroles and pies, waited in line to give condolences. And Robert, oh, he played his role to perfection. The grieving widower, dignified and quiet, expressing gratitude to everyone for their sympathy. To anyone who observed him, he was the very epitome of grace and humility. By April 1993, Robert Hamilton was 73 and still dwelling on the same family farm where he had spent most of his life. Spring had arrived at Chalco County. The dogwoods were blooming, the air filled with pollen, and farmers were preparing their fields for crops. For Robert, spring meant something else that year. It was finally time to address the old barn. That building had been an eyesore for years. The roof was caving in, the walls were leaning like an old drunk trying to stand up straight, and the wood was so rotten you could stick a finger right through it. His son, Robert Jr., had been badgering him for months to come in and knock it down. Dad, it's a liability, he'd said over Sunday dinner. If that thing collapses and someone gets hurt, you'll be the one in trouble. Just have it torn down already. So, Robert finally agreed. April 12, 1993, and a 3-man construction team from Butler arrived at the Hamilton property. They were equipped with a bulldozer, sledgehammers, and a clear plan. Bring the barn down, tidy up the debris, and flatten the foundation. 2, perhaps 3 days of work maximum. The team was headed by a local contractor named Dale Hutchkins, a 42-year-old man who had been in the trade for more than 2 decades. With him were 2 younger men, Kenny Marsh and Travis Cole, both in their mid-20s and both looking to make some extra money before the hot Alabama summer set in. The first day was uneventful. They labored systematically, tearing down the outside walls board by board, never allowing the entire structure to collapse on top of them. When the sun went down, only the skeletal remains of the barn stood, a half-dozen beams in the dusty old floor. The following morning, April 14th, they focused on that floor. It was the sort of building you used to find everywhere in rural Alabama in the old days. Wooden boards spread out over a dirt base. Most of the boards were so rotted that they just about fell apart in their hands. By mid-morning, the crew had moved towards the rear of the barn when Travis's crowbar struck something unusual. It was not the crumble of earth or the crunch of rock. It was something hard. He furrowed his brow, swiping the sweat from his forehead, and leaned in to take a closer inspection. "Hey, Dale," he yelled. "There's something odd over here." Dale and Kenny approached, boots crunching through the weathered boards. Travis nodded at an area of ground below the floor where the dirt seemed off, darker, more compact, like it had been disturbed once before and then tamped down again. "Most likely an old root cellar or something," Dale said, kneeling down. "Let's check it out." Travis picked up a shovel and began digging. The ground was hard but yielded in big, wet clods. He dug for several minutes, his shovel hitting something hard. Not wood, not stone. Something that made a hollow, dull sound. He stood stock still. For an instant, he thought perhaps it was an animal. Farms had their share of such surprises. A stray dog, a raccoon, possibly even a deer that had wandered into the barn years before. But as he scraped away the dirt, he saw it. The smooth line, the shape, the unmistakable size. "Dale," he said, his voice shaking, "you have to come see this." Dale went down to his knees next to him. When he saw the white surface of what was on the ground in front of him, his stomach went cold. It was a skull, a human skull. "Jesus Christ," Kenny breathed, taking a step back. Dale's ears rang with his own heartbeat. The air in that barn seemed to weigh a whole lot more suddenly. Something had been dug up here, and from the appearance of things, it had been buried a very long time ago. "Don't touch a thing," Dale snapped, his tone crisp and shaking simultaneously. "Travis, go get to the truck and call the sheriff's office, now." Travis didn't have to be asked twice. He tossed down the shovel and took off toward the truck, boots kicking up puffs of dust. The rest of the crew just stood there, gazing at the hole in the ground like it was going to suddenly start talking to them. Nobody spoke. The only thing anyone heard was the wind groaning through the half-fallen barn and the distant buzzing of bugs out in the fields beyond. Dale's hands trembled as he extracted a cigarette. He took a deep drag, attempting to calm himself down, but his thoughts were whirling. How long had the body lain there? Who was he? And, the question that he did not dare vocalize, did Robert Hamilton have any knowledge? 20 minutes passed, and the quiet was shattered by the crunching of gravel beneath tires. Two sheriff's department patrol cars came speeding up the drive, red and blue lights flashing off the weathered boards of the old barn. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw emerged first. He was a large man in his mid-50s with a thick mustache, sun-weathered skin, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen just about everything. Nothing like this, however. Bradshaw had been sheriff for 5 years, succeeding Wade Thornton upon retirement, and in all that time, he'd never handled anything like a buried body on the most respected man's farm in the county. Dale met him halfway along the trail. "Sheriff," he said softly, "we were dismantling the barn, and we discovered, well, you'll have to see for yourself." Bradshaw spoke little. His jaw clenched a little, and his eyes narrowed. "Show me." They walked out to the barn side by side. Dale indicated where the spot was. The sheriff knelt down, not wanting to touch anything. He didn't move the bones, didn't touch the ground, just examined the area quietly. Then he got up, picked up his radio, and notified them. "This is Sheriff Bradshaw. I need the Alabama Bureau of Investigation out here stat. We have human remains." By early afternoon, the Hamilton farm was a crime show set. Yellow tape around the barn. Deputies were waving traffic around, keeping rubberneckers back. A procession of state investigators, forensic specialists, and a medical examiner had arrived, making the otherwise quiet farm a full-scale investigation scene. They took pictures of everything. Every shot, every inch of the excavation site. A forensic anthropologist directed the excavation, gliding with the dexterity of a surgeon. They didn't employ shovels anymore, only tiny brushes, trowels, and gloved fingers, one delicate layer at a time, as if they were archaeologists digging up some ancient secret. And what they found was chilling. The bones were those of a young woman. That much was certain from the skeletal remains. She'd been in a shallow grave, perhaps 2 feet deep, just below the barn floor. Her body was curled to one side slightly, knees bent, arms wrapped over her chest, as if she'd been buried hurriedly. She'd been down there for a long time. The bones were dirty and earth-stained, but otherwise well-preserved, thanks to the dry ground underneath the barn. Then the team discovered something else, something that made every individual there become silent. Smaller bones, delicate, small, huddled next to the woman's pelvis. Fetal remains. She was pregnant. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Laura Simmons, in charge of the excavation, tightened her chest. Whoever this woman was, she'd been pregnant, and someone had put her here to rot like she didn't count. They continued to uncover more. Ripped fragments of yellow cloth, perhaps once a dress, pieces of white canvas that perhaps were shoes, and next to the skull, something sadly mundane, a tiny faded length of ribbon, the sort a young woman might have used to tie in her hair. Dr. Simmons treated each fragment as if it were holy, gently bagging and labeling them. Each piece was a clue, part of someone's history that had been kept quiet for decades. By late afternoon, the news had traveled through Butler quicker than wildfire. Word of mouth in small towns travels fast, faster than any paper. A body on Robert Hamilton's farm, buried beneath his barn. The town was abuzz with speculation. Outside the diner, at the church parking lot, by the gas station, everyone had an opinion. Who was it? How long did it stay there? Did old Robert Hamilton know? And for the first time in decades, people started to recall. Some of the older people exchanged nervous glances. A young woman, lost back in the early 70s. Could it be her? That notion spread throughout Chillicothe County like a cold wind. About 4 p.m., Loi Marina received the call. It was her daughter Margaret, voice shaking on the other end. She'd heard the news from a friend who worked at the sheriff's office and drove directly to her mother's residence. Hands clutched on the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. When she drove up, Ruby was in the garden, on her knees, weeding. She always did this when her mind was burdened. The same small plot of ground she'd cared for all those years, the only place where she could still find calm. "Mama," Margaret said, getting out of the car, her voice cracking. Ruby raised her head, a glimpse at her daughter's face, and she knew something was approaching. Ruby raised her head slowly. Her knees remained on the ground, hands smeared with dirt, the sun of the afternoon highlighting the silver threads in her hair. She stood there for a prolonged moment without speaking. Her face did not shift, neither shock nor sorrow, simply still. Then, almost in a whisper, her mouth opened. "Is it her?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know, but they're telling me it's a young woman, and she's there for a long time." Ruby stood up, stiff knees, wiping dirt from her palms. Her eyes were far away, as if she was seeing something from really far, something she'd never ceased to see. She didn't cry. She didn't lose it. She simply nodded slowly, a serene acceptance washing over her like she'd been waiting for this day to come all this time. "It's her," Ruby said softly. "I know that it is." In front of the Hamilton farm, Robert Hamilton stood on his porch, observing his peaceful land turn into a spectacle. Police cars blocked the driveway. White-suited investigators came and went under floodlights. Yellow tape snapped in the wind. And now, news trucks. Montgomery, Birmingham, even Mobile. The entire state was coming to see his world implode. His complexion was pale, and although the air was crisp, his forehead was beaded with sweat. He held on to the railing of the porch for support, his shaking hands trembling. When Sheriff Tom Bradshaw arrived, notebook clutched in his hand, Robert appeared like a man half his age. Weak, indecisive, trapped. "Mr. Hamilton," Bradshaw said calmly, "I'm going to have to ask you some questions." Robert's voice trembled as he spoke. I don't know. How could there be a body under my barn? I've lived here my entire life. I don't know anything about this." Bradshaw watched him closely. The jumping eyes, the swallowing nervously, The fact that his eyes kept jerking over toward the barn and then jumping away again. "We'll want you to come down to the station," Bradshaw told him at last, "just to answer a few questions." Robert nodded too rapidly. "Of course. Anything you want. I want to assist." But Bradshaw saw it. The fear, the guilt, the faint chink starting to appear in the veneer of a man who'd kept something back for far too long. By evening, the news had spread like wildfire. All the local television stations were playing it. Body discovered on Alabama farm, linked to 21-year-old cold case possible. In restaurants, patrons huddled around televisions. On porches, whispers spread through the evening darkness. Everyone in Butler understood what that title implied. Was it her? The name began making the rounds again after 20 years of quiet. Loi Marina, the girl who disappeared into thin air. And in a tiny house outside of town, Ruby Marina sat in her living room, a lone lamp throwing warm light across her rosary beads. Her fingers crept by slowly, in rhythm, the same way they had each and every night for 21 years. She didn't need the sheriff to call. She didn't need the DNA. A mother always knows. Her daughter was finally coming home. Detective Sarah Pritchard had witnessed enough death during 15 years with the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. But cold cases, those were something else. It wasn't so much about the evidence. It was about time, the heaviness of it, the families who had spent half their lives waiting for answers that never arrived. When she received the call regarding human remains discovered in Chalka County, she knew this one would be one that would haunt her. "This isn't just a case," she told her partner as she loaded up her files. "This is someone's story finally breaking through the dirt." Sarah Pritchard was 41, sharp-eyed, concentrated, reckoned for her tenacity. She'd pursued murderers through Birmingham, worked narcotics on the Gulf Coast, and reopened more cold cases than anyone in her department. But when she stepped onto the Hamilton farm on April 15th, something about the farm disturbed her. The stillness, the seclusion, the way the barn loomed like a sentinel over the past. She assembled her team right there on the property. Detective Marcus Webb, a seasoned investigator with a calm voice and a gift for getting people to talk. Linda Garrett, a forensic specialist who'd worked with the FBI's evidence response team before joining ABI. And Dr. Laura Simmons, the same forensic anthropologist who'd uncovered the remains the day before. Methodical, precise, brilliant. Together, they made a decision that would shape everything to come. This was no accident. This was murder, and they were going to crack it. The remains were taken carefully to the state forensic lab in Montgomery the next morning. April 16th, Dr. Simmons started the laborious work of examination. Days turned into hours. In the bright lab lights, the tale of the bones started revealing. The results were back within a week. The victim was a female, approximately 18 to 22 years old. She'd been buried for 15 to 25 years. The soil and bone condition confirmed long-term concealment beneath dry, compacted earth. And the cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the skull. One blow, clean, final. It would have killed her instantly. And just like that, the mystery that had haunted Butler for 2 decades was no longer buried. It was back in the light. And Detective Sarah Pritchard was going to ensure this time. The truth wouldn't remain concealed. That little fact struck Detective Pritchard hard. Whoever this young lady was, she hadn't lost just her life. She'd lost the life that was inside of her as well. It made the case personal, and it made Pritchard even more resolved to discover who did this. Meanwhile, the forensics team did their thing in Montgomery. Pritchard and Detective Webb went to the Chalka County Sheriff's Office to rummage through the records. The office had a mild scent of dust and old paper, the sort of place where decades' worth of forgotten tales resided in metal file cabinets. They didn't tarry long there before uncovering what they were after: the case file of Loi Marina. It was thin, worn, and jammed in the rear of a drawer that hadn't seen the light of day for decades. 2 decades, to be precise. Pritchard thumbed through the pages, the witness statements, the search grids, the interviews with the Hamiltons. And with each line, each scribble, she felt the pieces begin to fall into position. Loi Marina, 19 years old. Last seen on June 19, 1972. She'd been heading towards the Hamilton farm, and as told by Robert Hamilton, she'd never made it. But here they were in 1993, and a young woman's body had just been discovered buried beneath that same farm's barn floor. Pritchard glanced over at Webb. "We need dental records," she said. "If you're still with me and this tale has got you on edge, perhaps even holding your breath, take a moment to share it with someone who is as obsessed with true crime as you are. These cases are important, and keeping their stories alive is how justice finally comes home." Within 2 days, the dental records confirmed what Loi Marina had known deep in her heart. The body was Loi Marina's. Now, it wasn't just a question, it was a murder investigation. Pritchard and Webb started reinvestigating all the original 1972 suspects who were still living. Some had moved, others had died, but enough still lived to fill in more of the details about what actually occurred the week Loi went missing. The first one they interviewed was Margaret Marina, older sister of Loi. She sat across from Pritchard in a cramped interview room in the sheriff's office, hands clenched tight in her lap, eyes red and swollen. 21 years had gone by, but at that instant it felt like none at all. "Describe to me the weeks leading up to when she disappeared," Pritchard said softly. "Did Loi ever say anything that sounded unusual?" Margaret nodded, her voice shaking. "She said she was pregnant." Pritchard bent forward a little. "When did she say that to you?" "About a week prior to disappearing. She was afraid. She didn't know what to do." Pritchard's voice softened. "Did she mention who the father was?" Margaret paused, then dropped her eyes. "Yes, it was Robert Hamilton." The name seemed to float in the air like lead. "She refused to believe it at first," Margaret went on. "He'd been making improper advances for months. Little remarks, putting his hand on her arm when he didn't have to. Then one time, it went further. She was afraid to report him because he was her boss. Everybody in town liked him. She figured nobody would take her seriously." Pritchard's jaw clenched. "Did she ever talk to him about it?" "She was going to," said Margaret softly. "Told me she was going to speak to him Monday morning. Said she didn't want to destroy his family. But she couldn't remain there anymore. Needed money to get out of town, to begin again somewhere else." Margaret glanced up, tears streaming down her face. "That Monday, that was the day she vanished." Next, Pritchard and Webb tracked down Loi's best friend, Karen Bledsoe, now living in Mobile. Over the phone, Karen confirmed what Margaret had said. "Loi was afraid of him," Karen said. "She told me he was making her uneasy, always looking for reasons to hang around her, making comments that were not appropriate. She wanted to leave, but she had bills to pay. I advised her to get out, but she said she just needed a few months to save up." The puzzle was taking shape. Loi had been with child. She'd had it in mind to have words with Robert Hamilton that morning, and she'd disappeared before noon. Pritchard returned to the original 1972 interview transcripts. According to his testimony, Robert Hamilton said Loi never arrived that day. But now, with Margaret's evidence and the body discovered buried under his barn, that tale was no longer credible. Loi had arrived at the Hamilton farm, and Robert Hamilton had too. Pritchard and Webb began systematically reconstructing the timeline. They re-interviewed Eunice Caldwell, then in her 80s, who still recalled waving to Loi that morning as she walked along the road. They interviewed Jimmy Tate, the truck driver who had spotted her beside the Hamilton property. Each memory, each recollection, was another strand leading to the same destination, the Hamilton farm. And as the investigation continued, it became agonizingly apparent. Robert Hamilton hadn't merely buried a young woman beneath his barn. He'd buried the truth along with her, and lived with it for 21 years. The call came on April 23, 1993, 9 days since the construction crew had discovered the bones beneath the barn floor. Detective Sarah Pritchard sat at her desk in Montgomery, folding up the dental comparison report in her hand. She had read it 3 times, craving that one last solitary surety before she made the call that would alter everything. The identification was positive. No question. No room for mistake. The remains discovered on the Hamilton land were Loi Marina. Pritchard called the Choctaw County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Bradshaw answered on the second ring. "It's her," she told him. "Dental records confirm a positive identification. We have to inform the family." There was a long pause on the line, the kind that carries the weight of what's coming. "I'll go with you," Bradshaw said finally. Ruby deserves to hear this in person. They arrived at Ruby's house shortly before noon. Margaret was already there. She'd remained with her mother after the discovery, refusing to leave Ruby by herself with the pain of waiting. Ruby opened the door before they could ring the bell. She'd seen the official cars drive up. Somehow she already knew. "It's Lee, isn't it?" she asked, her voice firm even as the tears came. Pritchard nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Dental records confirm it." "I'm so sorry." Ruby's knees gave out. Margaret caught her, holding her as 21 years of hope. Hope she'd clung to even when reason told her otherwise. Finally shattered. "My baby," Ruby whispered. "My baby girl." They sat in the same living room where Ruby had stood by the phone for all those years. Pritchard told them what the forensic experts had discovered and what it would mean, being careful not to leave out the worst of the details. "We're handling this as a homicide case," she said to them. "We will discover who killed your daughter. I promise you that." Ruby's face hardened, tears streaking down but eyes sharp as winter. "It was him, wasn't it? Robert Hamilton?" she asked. Pritchard measured her words. "We're following every lead, Mrs. Marina. He is a person of interest." Ruby's reply cut like a wound. "He killed her," she said, voice breaking. "He killed my baby and buried her like she was nothing. He's been out all these years attending church, living his life while I died daily." Margaret wrapped her tighter, muffled sobs against her shoulder. "We'll get justice for Lee," Pritchard vowed. Ruby shook her head. "Justice won't bring her back," she replied. "It won't restore the 21 years. But I want him to pay. I want the world to know." Meanwhile, back in Montgomery, Dr. Laura Simmons completed the complete examination of the remains. The manner of death was evident and merciless. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head. One strong blow, struck from behind, which probably instantly killed her. The object wasn't exactly determined, but something heavy and flat. A board, a shovel, some piece of machinery was the likely instrument. The remains of the fetus verified what Margaret had informed police. Loi was approximately 8 to 10 weeks pregnant at the time of death. In 1993, DNA testing was not as advanced as in subsequent years, but that a fetus existed was noted, photographed, and kept as important evidence. The burial itself spoke volumes. The shallow grave, dug directly under the barn floor, and the hasty placement of the body spoke loudly of panic and rage, masquerading as haste, not deliberation and planning. The barn was on Robert Hamilton's land. His barn, his crime scene. Detective Sarah Pritchard and her team set to work building the picture. Piece by piece, detail by detail, and with each finding, Robert Hamilton's 1972 alibi disintegrated like damp paper. He had always asserted Loi never arrived at his farm that morning, but the plain, obstinate reality was hidden right under his barn. She was there. She'd come right into the spot where her life would be taken. Then there was the break that turned everything around. Her name was Vera Hutchkins, and at the time, way back in 1972, she'd been a 26-year-old housewife residing half a mile from the Hamilton farm. She'd been questioned as part of the initial investigation, but hadn't paid much attention to what she saw that morning, or at least not until now. Detective Marcus Webb, investigating on a list of residents in that neighborhood, located her still residing in the same dwelling. She was 47 now, sitting on the porch sipping a glass of sweet tea when Webb questioned whether she recalled June 19, 1972. Vera's brow creased, then her eyes opened a bit wider. "I saw her," she replied slowly. "I was hanging out the washing that morning. Must have been about 8:30, perhaps 9:15, and I saw a young woman in a yellow sundress walking up the Hamilton driveway. I recall thinking it was strange. Their nanny came earlier in the day." Webb's pulse accelerated. "You sure it was the Hamilton driveway?" "Positive," Vera replied. "You could see it as plain as day from my yard. She just came right up to the house. Then I went inside to look in on my baby. I didn't pay no mind to it till they said she was missing. When the sheriff was by asking questions, I didn't think that seeing somebody walking to work was out of the ordinary, you know?" Webb sat forward. "Did you tell him that you'd seen her come into the farm?" Vera looked puzzled, trying to recall. "I said I saw a girl walking, I think, but perhaps not where precisely. It was so long ago." Webb thanked her, then at once called Pritchard. "We've got him," he said. Loi arrived at the farm. Hamilton lied. From that point on, the case clicked into focus. The detectives spread out every scrap of evidence across the table like a jigsaw puzzle. Loi's body was on his land, buried beneath his barn. A witness saw her walk to his house. She was pregnant, almost certainly with his child. And Margaret's earlier statement confirmed that Loi had planned to confront him that morning. When they went digging back into Hamilton's history, the image grew darker. A housekeeper who worked for the Hamiltons during the late 60s reported that Robert had made unwanted advances, pinned her up once in the laundry room, attempted to kiss her. She'd quit and never returned. A 1975 teenage babysitter remembered how uneasy he made her feel, how he would always seem to have some reason for being around, to stand a little too close. Another ex-employee said he was controlling, hot-headed, particularly when a woman had the temerity to challenge him. The trend was as clear as day. Robert Hamilton was a predator, a man who'd used charm, reputation, and the corrupting privileges of power to conceal himself. When Loi, a pregnant teenager, was about to out him, he didn't merely lose control. He silenced her. By early May 1993, the puzzle was solved. The evidence was persuasive. The two-decade facade Robert Hamilton constructed was cracking wide open. On May 3rd, Detective Pritchard entered Sheriff Bradshaw's office and dumped the thick case file on his desk. "We have probable cause," she said calmly. "It's time to bring him in." Bradshaw glanced at the folder, then at Pritchard. Finally, after a lengthy silence, he nodded. "Let's get a warrant." Robert James Hamilton was 73 years old by that time, the epitome of small-town propriety. He still resided on the same farm his family had lived on for generations. His hair was now snow-white, his hands shook a trifle as he picked up his coffee cup, and he hobbled about with a cane after hip surgery 2 years previously. Each Sunday morning, he went to First Baptist Church, taking the same pew he'd sat in for decades, nodding his head to the sermon, shaking hands at the end of service, smiling the smile of a man with nothing to hide. If only the congregation was aware. Robert Hamilton was always admired by people. He was one of those men whose reputation was set in stone: successful, generous, reliable. After Loi Marina disappeared, or rather after he killed her and buried her under the barn, he continued constructing that image brick by brick. In the 1970s, he diversified his agricultural business. In the 1980s, he was buying timberland, serving on the county planning commission, and writing checks to every charity in town that asked. When his wife Diane died of cancer in 1987, the entire town mourned with him. Neighbors delivered casseroles for weeks, came over to pray with him, and reminded him what a good husband he'd been. Nobody guessed that behind that courteous smile and firm handshake was a man who'd murdered a young woman to protect his own reputation. But not Detective Sarah Pritchard. For weeks she'd been observing him. Not the public image, but the man beneath the mask. And she saw him for what he truly was: a textbook narcissist, a manipulator who'd spent decades manipulating people and situations to achieve his own ends. Robert Hamilton wasn't some guy who lost control one terrible afternoon. He was a guy who thought control was his prerogative, and when some threat came along that might take that power away from him, he ensured the threat was eliminated. Loi Marina had been that threat. She was 19 years old, young, defenseless, in need of him to provide for her so she could work. He was 52, married, rich, respected in society. The difference couldn't have been wider. According to Margaret's testimony and statements from Loi's friends, Robert had been crossing lines for months. The lingering looks, the innocent comments about her looks, finding reasons to keep her alone when his wife wasn't around. And then, sometime in the spring of 1972, it went much further. Loi never confided every painful detail in her sister, but the message was clear. Robert Hamilton had attacked her, and she'd become pregnant. For Robert, this was not just scandal, it was a time bomb. If people discovered that he'd gotten his teen nanny pregnant, his world would fall apart in one night. His reputation, his church role, his marriage, all over. He could even end up in prison. So when Loi stepped up that gravel driveway on June 19, 1972, intending to confront him and demand money so she could split town, Robert saw only one way out. He murdered her. Pritchard's team constructed a psychological portrait that made the image agony to behold. Robert Hamilton craved control like he needed oxygen. He craved to be admired, respected, worshipped even. His self-concept rested entirely on what other people perceived him to be, and he would do anything to maintain the image. He was also supremely arrogant. Most murderers attempt to cover their tracks, bury the body deep, erase the linkage. Not Robert. He buried Loi underneath his own barn, and then lived above her remains for 21 years. He'd passed by that barn hundreds of times, perhaps even smiled at it. That kind of confidence, or insanity, stemmed from one thing. He firmly believed he was above the law, and for 20 years he was. When the news spread that Robert Hamilton was a suspect in Loi Marina's death, Choctaw County didn't know whether to believe it. The church deacon man who'd served for 15 years? The same Robert Hamilton who gave money to re-roof the church after that storm in '85? The man who ran the Christmas toy drive annually? Impossible, some said. There's no way. I've known Robert my whole life. He's a good man, a godly man. The police must have it wrong. But others weren't so sure. The whispers started, quiet at first, spreading through the diner, the church pews, and the grocery store aisles. And slowly doubt began to take root. A woman remembered an experience at a church social in 1979. She was 23, a newlywed, when Robert Hamilton cornered her with a friendly smile that quickly grew into something much less innocent. When she rebuffed him, he just adjusted his tie and behaved as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She never told anyone. Who would believe her truth over his? Another woman, now in her 60s, said she'd been a housekeeper for the Hamiltons in the late 1960s. She recalled the off-color remarks, the lingering caresses, the way he'd make her skin crawl. She left after 3 months and never looked back. Then a man stepped forward, a farm worker who'd worked for Robert as a teenager in the 1970s. He had a temper, the man said. Didn't take much to set him off. A gate left open, a tractor in the wrong place. Everything had to be his way, and if you crossed him, you knew it. Step by step, the pattern became irrefutable. Robert Hamilton had taken decades to get in practice, exercising his power to take what he wanted, from whoever he could bully, and intimidating the rest into submission. For his 4 grown children, the news came like a freight train. The eldest, Robert Jr., issued a brief statement via the family attorney. Our family is cooperating fully with authorities. We are shocked and devastated by these allegations. Privately, the Hamilton children were stunned. The man who taught them how to ride a bike, bait a fishing hook, and recite grace before meals could also be a murderer. One of his daughters, Catherine, later informed investigators she'd always felt something sinister in her father, something she couldn't quite define. He was so charming in public, she spoke softly, but at home he was cold, controlling. My mother walked on eggshells around him. Yet, another daughter sobbed as she talked to detectives. I thought I was dreaming. The way he'd stare at young women, the things he'd say. You don't want to think your own father might do something like this. But now I realize. I see exactly what he was. And throughout all the heartache, one question hung in the air. Why? For Detective Sarah Pritchard, the solution was agonizingly obvious. Robert Hamilton murdered Loi Marina because she loomed as a threat to the fantasy he'd constructed his entire life on. His ideal marriage, his unblemished reputation, his ability to control others. When Loi appeared before him on that June morning, pregnant and terrified, demanding assistance, perhaps even demanding justice, Robert felt the walls closing in. Instead of accepting the fate, he turned to violence. A single blow, sudden, fatal. Then with chilling calm, he buried her under the barn floor, right there on his property, and spun a lie that would last more than 2 decades. She never showed up for work, and he lived that lie with ease. For 21 years, he'd smiled at Ruby Marina in the grocery store, nodded politely in the church pew behind her, knowing full well that he was the reason her daughter never came home. That wasn't just guilt. That was arrogance. The kind that comes from believing you're untouchable, but not anymore. On the morning of September 15th, 1993, 5 months after Loi's remains were found, Robert Hamilton finally faced justice. Detective Pritchard arrived at the Hamilton farm just after dawn with a team of deputies and a warrant in hand. Robert answered the door in his bathrobe, pale and trembling. By afternoon, he was in a tiny, windowless interrogation room at the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office. Cinder block walls, icy metal table anchored to the ground. On one side of the cold metal table sat Pritchard and Detective Marcus Webb. On the other side stood Robert Hamilton and his attorney, a smooth Montgomery lawyer by the name of Gerald Whitmore, the sort of man who billed by the minute and smiled like a chess player 3 moves ahead. The room was silent, motionless, weighed down by 21 years of hidden reality. And the man who had duped a whole town was now out of options where to conceal himself. He hadn't resisted when the deputies arrived. Didn't yell, didn't beg, just stood in his bathrobe, white and shaking, as they handcuffed him and brought him out the front door. Neighbors poked their heads through curtains, their mouths moving in hushed tones as the man they once respected was taken away in a patrol car. Now, several hours into it, Robert Hamilton sat across from Detective Sarah Pritchard in a small windowless room at the Choctaw County Sheriff's Office. The air was thick and heavy, the cinder block walls painted that same familiar bureaucratic beige. Across the table, his attorney, Gerald Whitmore, a silver-tongued lawyer from Montgomery, who looked like he billed by the breath, leaned in close, reminding Robert to say nothing. But Pritchard could see it, the same old condescension in his eyes, that flicker that declared him still the smartest man in the room, still convinced he could sweet-talk or out-reason his way out of it. She'd known men like him before, men who couldn't resist defending themselves, men who still thought they controlled the outcome even when they dug themselves in deep. She began systematically, speaking quietly but firmly. "We have dental records placing the remains as belonging to Loi Marina." Robert's eyes fell to the table. "We have forensic evidence indicating she died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head." His jaw clenched, a muscle that twitched in his cheek. "We have a witness who observed Loi enter your property on the morning of June 19th, 1972, the same morning you testified she never arrived." Whitmore inched closer. "Don't respond to that, Robert. Let me take care of it." But Pritchard was not finished. She pushed another sheet of paper across the table. "We also have a witness from Loi's sister. She alleges Loi was pregnant, that she intended to approach you that morning, that you were the father." Robert's fist clenched on the metal table. "We know she reached your farm, Mr. Hamilton," Pritchard went on. "We know you lied, and we know you murdered her." "Robert, stop," his attorney cautioned, but Robert couldn't. "She was going to destroy me," he stated finally, in a low, bitter tone. The room was quiet. Whitmore closed his eyes, sensing his client had just passed the point of no return. "Tell me what occurred," Pritchard spoke softly, and Robert told him. "She came that morning, like always, but she wasn't the same. She was furious, said she was pregnant, said it was mine. Told her she'd tell Diane, my wife, tell the church, tell the sheriff if I didn't provide her with money to leave town." His voice increased, tinged with resentment. "I told her she was crazy, no one would believe her, but she would not cease. She said that I'd ruined her life, said she'd destroy mine as well." Pritchard did not break the silence. She simply allowed silence to speak. "So what did you do?" she asked at last. Robert swallowed. "I told her to wait for me in the barn. Told her I'd give her the money, that we'd work something out. But when we got inside, she just kept ranting and raving, calling me a hypocrite, telling everyone they had to see what kind of man I actually was." His features contorted, the fury of years resurfacing. "I couldn't let her ruin me. I'd worked too hard, established too much. So I picked up a shovel against the wall, and I struck her. Just once." The words lingered in the air. "She fell," he muttered, "and didn't move." Pritchard didn't respond. The recorder on the table recorded every word, every breath. "I panicked," he went on, "had no idea what to do. So I dug a grave right there, under the floorboards, bury her, hide it, replace the boards. Nobody ever found out." Detective Marcus Webb, seated next to Pritchard, finally broke his silence. 21 years, he said quietly. You carried that around for 21 years. Robert's gaze flickered up, his face cold, expressionless. She put me in that position, he stated bluntly. She came onto my property, threatened my family, tried to destroy everything I'd worked for. What was I supposed to do? Even here, in an interrogation room, his statement on tape, witnessed, Robert Hamilton blamed his victim. Pritchard remained standing, her expression impenetrable. Robert James Hamilton, you are being held for the first-degree murder of Loi Marina. You have the right to remain silent, though it appears you've already waived that. Whitmore's head was in his hands. It was finished. The Robert James Hamilton trial commenced on March 7, 1994, within the historic Choctaw County Courthouse, a handsome red brick structure that had watched over Butler, Alabama, since 1907. The courtroom was filled to capacity, each bench occupied, each aisle filled. Individuals stood against the walls and leaned over shoulders, hoping to catch a glimpse of the individual at the center of a 22-year enigma. In the street, television reporters from Montgomery, Birmingham, even Atlanta occupied the courthouse square, their satellite trucks rumbling as reporters prepared their live reports. This wasn't another trial. This was the long-awaited judgment for Robert Hamilton, the upstanding farmer, church deacon, and family man who'd lived decades behind a veneer of decency while one family mourned in secret. District Attorney Michael Thornton, no relation to the former sheriff, led the prosecution with quiet precision. His case was solid as stone. They had Robert's taped confession, his own voice admitting he'd struck Loi Marina with a shovel and buried her beneath his barn. They had forensic proof. Dr. Laura Simmons testified about the blunt force trauma to Loi's skull, the fetal remains confirming her pregnancy, and the exact location of her body on Hamilton's property. Then the witnesses. Margaret Marina testified, her voice shaking but firm, describing her sister's fear, her pregnancy, and her intention to confront Robert Hamilton that fateful morning. Vera Hutchkins testified next. She'd seen Loi approach the Hamilton property, dispelling any uncertainty that the young woman had gone there that day. For the prosecution, the defense attorney Gerald Whitmore tried to do his best, but the floor was giving way beneath him. He attempted to portray Robert as a sick, elderly man, 74 years old and in ill health, not a threat to anyone. He spoke of how time distorts memory, how the confession could have been extracted under duress. But the tape told a different story, and the evidence was relentless. There was no dismissing the body buried under his barn. In less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came back. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly. We find the defendant, Robert James Hamilton, guilty of first-degree murder. There was a soft gasp that ran through the courtroom. At the front of the courtroom, Ruby Marina's eyes closed in a prayer, tears falling down her face. 22 years. 22 years of praying, waiting, and not knowing. And now, finally, justice had come. Robert Hamilton was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. At 74, it was tantamount to a death sentence. Before the judge signed off on sentencing, Margaret stood to make her victim impact statement. Her voice trembled, but her words sliced through the silence like a sword. Loi was my sister, my best friend, my guardian, she said, looking directly at Robert Hamilton. You stole her from us. You stole her life, her dreams, my father's will to live. You stole 22 years of my mother's life, years she spent wondering, hurting, praying for answers. But you didn't win. We never gave up. We never lost faith. And now the world knows the truth. You're not a respected man. You're a killer. And that's how you'll be remembered. Robert sat still, his countenance a mask of vacuousness. No regret, no remorse. Only that same empty pride that had driven him throughout his deceptions of the past 20 years. Behind him, his children sat quietly, heads down, eyes lowered to the floor. Their father's ruin had devastated them. Some would one day leave Choctaw County itself, not able to stomach the Hamilton name. But the effect of this case extended far beyond Butler, Alabama. It became a watershed moment for cold case investigations throughout the state. A reminder that time can fog memories but not shame. That families who wouldn't let go can still receive justice, even after decades. Robert Hamilton passed away in prison on the 12th of November, 1998, at the age of 78. He never did apologize, never did show remorse. He died with his arrogance. But Loi Marina's reputation endured. In 1995, her mother Ruby established the Loi Marina Memorial Scholarship Fund, presented annually to a young woman from Choctaw County who is going on to college. The same dream Loi never had a chance to pursue. A small memorial was erected in Butler's town center, a smooth stone engraved with her name, her dates, and the phrase "gone, but never forgotten." Ruby lived long enough to witness the murderer of her daughter brought to court. She died peacefully on June 19, 2001, precisely 29 years from the day that Loi vanished. Her friends reported that she finally found peace, knowing that her daughter's tale had been told and that justice had been served. If this story touched you, take a moment to honor it. Like, share, and subscribe. Because stories like Loi's remind us of something vital. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Time may pass, but truth endures. Loi Marina's life was stolen far too soon, but her memory lives on. In a scholarship that gives hope, in a memorial that stands in her hometown, and in the hearts of all those who would not let her be forgotten. Rest in peace, Loi Marina. Your tale is told, and justice finally was done.